Rebecca stared at the empty bank account screen on her phone, her hands trembling as she refreshed the app for the 10th time. The numbers didn't change. $0.37. That was all that remained of the life she had built. Over 8 years of marriage, 3 days ago, she had been a normal woman living in a comfortable suburban home with her husband Michael. She had a part-time job at the local bookstore, a small circle of friends, and plans for the weekend. Everything seemed fine until she came home early from work to find Michael stuffing suitcases into his car. "We need to talk," he had said, but his eyes couldn't meet hers. The conversation that followed shattered her world completely. He was leaving with his coworker Jessica. The joint accounts were empty. The mortgage was 3 months behind. The house would be foreclosed within 2 weeks. "How could you do this?" "To me?" Rebecca had whispered, but Michael was already backing out of the driveway. He left behind divorce papers on the kitchen table and a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." Rebecca had spent the next 2 days in a haze of phone calls and desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage. The bank was unsympathetic. The mortgage company wouldn't negotiate. Her credit cards were maxed out from expenses she hadn't even known about. Michael had been spending money for months, apparently preparing for his escape. Her sister lived across the country and had always disapproved of Michael anyway. Her parents had passed away 5 years earlier, and she had no other family to turn to. The few friends she had were mutual friends with Michael, and she couldn't bear the thought of explaining what had happened. Pride kept her from asking for help, even when she desperately needed it. So she packed her remaining belongings into her 10-year-old Honda Civic and drove away from the only home she had known as an adult. She had no destination in mind, just a desperate need to escape the suffocating shame and betrayal that seemed to follow her everywhere. The first night, she slept in her car at a rest stop, jolting awake every time another vehicle pulled in. The second night, she found a cheap motel, but realized she couldn't afford to keep spending money on rooms. She had maybe $300 in cash and no income. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. By the third day, she found herself driving through the mountains of Montana, far from the Illinois suburb where her old life had crumbled. The landscape was beautiful but alien to her. Rolling hills stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with cattle and horses. She had never lived anywhere but the city, and the vast emptiness both calmed and terrified her. Her car had been making strange noises for the past 50 miles. A grinding sound that seemed to be getting worse. She had been ignoring it, hoping it would go away, but now smoke was starting to rise from under the hood. She pulled over to the shoulder and sat there for a moment, trying not to cry. The weather radio she had been listening to crackled with increasingly urgent warnings. A severe thunderstorm system was moving through the area. Hail was possible. Flooding was expected in low-lying areas. Travelers were advised to seek shelter immediately. Rebecca looked around at the empty landscape. She hadn't seen another car in 20 minutes. Her phone showed no signal. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, moving faster than seemed possible. She had to find shelter, but where? She coaxed her car back to life and drove slowly, watching the smoke grow thicker. The grinding noise was now accompanied by a high-pitched whining that made her wince. She passed a mailbox, then another, signs of civilization in this remote area. The first drops of rain hit her windshield as she spotted a weathered wooden sign, Copper Creek Ranch. The driveway was long and gravel, disappearing over a hill. She had no choice but to hope whoever lived there would help her. Her car made it exactly 50 feet past the gate before the engine died completely. Steam poured from under the hood, and no amount of turning the key would bring it back to life. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof of her car with increasing intensity. Rebecca sat in the darkness, watching lightning illuminate the storm clouds above. She had never felt so alone in her life. Everything she had counted on had been stripped away, and now she was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no money, no plan, and no hope. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the ground. She pulled her jacket tighter and tried to think of what to do next. She could walk to the house and ask for help, but what would she say? How could she explain that she was basically homeless, broke, and desperate? The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Her car offered little protection from the storm's fury. Water was starting to seep in through the worn weather stripping around the windows. She thought about Michael and Jessica, probably safe and warm in some hotel room, planning their new life together. The anger that rose in her chest was almost overwhelming. How could he have done this to her? How could he have left her with nothing? But anger wouldn't fix her car or find her shelter. She needed to focus on survival. The storm was getting worse, and she couldn't stay in the car much longer. Lightning was striking closer now, and she could hear the wind picking up. Rebecca took a deep breath and opened her car door. The rain immediately soaked through her clothes, and the wind nearly knocked her over. She grabbed her purse and ran toward where she thought she had seen lights, hoping desperately that someone would be home. The gravel driveway was already turning to mud under her feet. She slipped and nearly fell, catching herself on a fence. Everything was chaos around her, the howling wind, the driving rain, the constant flash of lightning. She had never been in a storm this severe. She could barely make out the shape of a house ahead, warm light glowing from its windows. It looked like sanctuary, but would the people inside help a stranger? She had no choice but to find out. This storm was dangerous, and she was completely exposed. Rebecca stumbled toward the house, her heart pounding with fear and desperation. She had hit rock bottom, but maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Someone had to help her. Someone had to care that she was out here alone in the storm. The rain was so heavy now that she could barely breathe. Each step was a struggle against the wind and the mud. But she kept moving toward those lights, toward the possibility of warmth and safety, toward whatever came next in her shattered life. As she reached the porch, she realized she was crying, though the rain washed away her tears as quickly as they fell. Everything she had known was gone, but she was still alive. She had survived the worst betrayal of her life, and somehow she would survive this storm too. David Morrison had been checking on his horses when he heard the engine sputtering outside his gate. Living alone on 2,000 acres of Montana ranch land, he didn't get many visitors, especially not during storms like this one. The weather. Radio had been warning about severe conditions all day, and he'd been preparing for the worst. His Mari Luna was due to fall any day now, and storms always made the animals nervous. He'd moved the pregnant horses into the main barn and double-checked all the latches and doors. The old barn had weathered many storms over the past 40 years, but it still needed constant attention during severe weather. David had his own reasons for preferring solitude. 2 years ago, he'd returned from his third deployment overseas with injuries that ended his military career. The shrapnel in his left leg was a constant reminder of the IED explosion that had changed everything. 3 of his unit members hadn't made it home at all, and the survivor's guilt was something he carried every day. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and working the land helped quiet the noise in his head. The physical work was challenging with his limitations, but it gave him purpose. Most days he could manage the pain and the memories. Some days were harder than others. Tonight was shaping up to be one of the difficult ones. The storm reminded him too much of that night in Afghanistan when everything went wrong. The thunder sounded like explosions, and the flashing lightning brought back memories he'd rather forget. He'd learned to cope by staying busy, so he'd been checking and rechecking everything on the ranch. When he saw the headlights through the rain, his first instinct was to ignore them. He'd learned to be careful about strangers after some bad experiences with people looking to take advantage of a veteran living alone. But as the lightning illuminated the scene, he could see the car had broken down completely. Steam was rising from the hood, and someone was inside. David grabbed his rain jacket and headed toward the gate. The storm was getting worse by the minute, with winds that could knock a person down. As he got closer, he could make out a figure hunched over the steering wheel. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing the situation for potential threats, but all he saw was someone in trouble. He knocked on the driver's side window, raising his voice over the howling wind. "Ma'am, are you okay in there?" The woman who looked up at him had clearly been crying. Her dark hair was plastered to her face and her clothes were soaked through. She rolled down the window a few inches, still cautious about talking to a stranger. "My car broke down," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know where else to go." David could see the fear in her eyes, and something about her desperation reminded him of his own darkest moments. "You can't stay out here in this weather," he said firmly. "It's not safe. Come inside until the storm passes." Rebecca hesitated. Everything she'd been taught about stranger danger was telling her to stay in the car, but the storm was getting worse. Lightning was striking closer to the ground, and she could feel the car shaking with each gust of wind. She had no choice but to trust this man. "I don't want to impose," she said, but David was already shaking his head. "This storm isn't playing around," he replied. "I've got coffee and a warm place to sit. We can figure out your car situation once this passes." Rebecca grabbed her purse and what few belongings she could carry. David helped her with her bags, his slight limp barely noticeable as he moved with practiced efficiency. Together they ran toward the house, both of them soaked by the time they reached the covered porch. The ranch house was modest but welcoming. The living room had a stone fireplace with a fire already crackling, and the smell of coffee mixed with the scent of leather and wood. It was clearly a bachelor's home, but it was clean and comfortable. Western artwork hung on the walls, and family photos sat on the mantelpiece. "Let me get you some dry clothes," David said, disappearing into another room. He returned with a flannel shirt and sweatpants. "These will be too big, but they're warm and dry. Bathroom's down the hall if you want to change." Rebecca looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her makeup was completely washed away, her hair was a mess, and her clothes were muddy and torn. She looked like she'd been through a war, which wasn't far from the truth, when she emerged in David's clothes rolled up at the sleeves and ankles. He had hot coffee waiting and had added another log to the fire. He changed out of his wet clothes too, and she noticed the careful way he moved, favoring his left side. "Thank you," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I'm Rebecca by the way. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." "David," he replied, settling into a chair across from her. "And you don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same thing." But Rebecca knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have helped a stranger in a storm. She'd learned recently that people weren't always what they seemed, and kindness was rarer than she'd once believed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind was howling like a living thing, and the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like hail against the windows. Lightning continued to flash, illuminating the room in brief, stark moments. "This is some storm," Rebecca said finally, just to break the silence. David nodded. "Spring storms in Montana can be unpredictable. This one's particularly bad, though. I've been watching the weather reports all day." "Do you live here alone?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded too personal, too forward. "Just me and the horses," David said simply. "It's a working ranch, cattle and horses mostly. Been in my family for 40 years. Rebecca could hear the pride in his voice when he talked about the ranch, but also something else. A loneliness that she recognized because she felt it too. Here was a man who had chosen solitude, but she wondered if he was truly content with it. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you from around here?" Rebecca's coffee mug suddenly felt heavy in her hands. How could she explain that she was basically homeless? That her husband had abandoned her, that she was driving aimlessly with no plan and no money? The shame of it all came rushing back. "I'm from Illinois originally," she said carefully. "I was just traveling through." David seemed to sense there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he got up to check the fire and add another log. The movement was careful and deliberate, and Rebecca noticed him wince slightly as he stood. "Were you hurt?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Old injury," he said simply. "Nothing that won't heal eventually." But Rebecca could see in his eyes that some wounds ran deeper than the physical ones. There was a sadness there that she understood all too well. They were both carrying burdens that couldn't be easily shared with strangers. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the ranch house there was warmth and safety. For the first time in days, Rebecca felt like she could breathe again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was grateful for this unexpected refuge and the quiet man who had offered it without asking for anything in return. As the fire crackled and the coffee warmed her from the inside out, Rebecca realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The morning after the storm, Rebecca woke up on David's couch feeling more rested than she had in weeks. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and she could hear the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For a moment she forgot where she was and why she was there. Then reality came flooding back. David was already dressed and moving around the kitchen when she appeared in the doorway, still wearing his oversized clothes from the night before. He looked up from the stove where he was cooking eggs and bacon. "Morning," he said simply. "Hope you're hungry." Rebecca felt awkward accepting more help from this stranger, but the smell of breakfast made her realize she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "You don't have to feed me," she said, though her stomach growled in protest. "I'm cooking anyway," David replied, setting a plate in front of her. "Besides, you'll need energy to deal with your car situation." After breakfast, they walked out to examine her Honda. In the bright morning light, the damage looked even worse than it had the night before. Steam had stopped rising from the engine, but a dark puddle of oil had formed beneath the car. David lifted the hood and shook his head. "Blown head gasket," he said. "Maybe worse. This car's going to need some serious work." Rebecca felt her heart sink. "How much do you think it will cost?" David's expression was sympathetic. "More than the car's worth, I'd guess. You might be looking at $1,500, maybe $2,000. $2,000 might as well have been $2 million. Rebecca had less than $300 to her name and no way to get more. She stood there staring at her broken car, feeling the weight of her situation pressing down on her. "I can call Tommy's garage in town," David offered. "He's fair and honest. Maybe he can work something out." But Rebecca knew there was no working anything out. She was stranded, broke, and had nowhere to go. The shame of it all made her want to disappear completely. "I'll figure something out," she said. Though they both knew she had no idea how. David watched her for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something internally. Finally, he spoke. "Look, I know this is going to sound strange, but I could use some help around here. The ranch is too much for one person to handle, especially with my leg the way it is." Rebecca looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of help?" "General ranch work," he said. "Feeding animals, cleaning stalls, mending fences. It's hard work, but I could offer room and board in exchange, just until you figure out your next move." The offer was tempting, but Rebecca had never done manual labor in her life. She'd worked in a bookstore, for crying out loud. What did she know about ranching? "I don't know anything about horses or cattle," she admitted. "Most of it you can learn," David said. "And honestly, I could use the company. Gets pretty quiet out here." Rebecca studied his face, trying to read his motives. Was this genuine kindness? Or was there something else behind the offer? She'd been betrayed so recently that trusting anyone felt dangerous. "I don't want your pity," she said finally. "It's not pity," David replied. "It's business. I need help, and you need a place to stay. Simple as that." That afternoon, David began teaching Rebecca the basics of ranch work. He showed her how to fill water troughs, how to measure out feed for the horses, and how to clean the stalls properly. The work was backbreaking for someone who wasn't used to physical labor, but Rebecca threw herself into it with desperate determination. By evening, every muscle in her body ached, and her hands were raw from handling the tools. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was accomplishing something. She was earning her keep, not just accepting charity. David watched her work with growing respect. Most city people would have given up after the first hour, but Rebecca kept going even when he could see she was struggling. She had grit, and that was something that couldn't be taught. "You did good today," he said as they sat on the porch after dinner, both exhausted from the day's work. I feel like I got hit by a truck, Rebecca replied, but she was smiling slightly. That feeling goes away after a week or two, David said. Your body gets used to it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. The storm had cleared the air, and everything looked fresh and clean. It was beautiful country, Rebecca had to admit, even if it was completely foreign to her. Can I ask you something? She said after a while. David nodded. What happened to your leg? David was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he spoke. IED in Afghanistan. Roadside bomb. 3 of my unit didn't make it home. I'm sorry, Rebecca said softly. It was 2 years ago, David said. Most days I'm fine. Some days are harder than others. Rebecca understood about hard days. She'd been having a lot of them lately. What about you? David asked. What brought you to Montana? Rebecca had been dreading this question, but somehow it felt easier to talk about it now. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the fact that David had shared something personal about himself. My husband left me, she said simply. Cleaned out our bank accounts and disappeared with his coworker. I lost everything. David didn't offer meaningless platitudes or try to minimize her pain. He just nodded, understanding in his silence. Sorry, he said finally. That's a hard thing to go through. I keep thinking I should have seen it coming, Rebecca continued. There must have been signs, but I was so busy trying to be the perfect wife that I missed them all. Some people are good at hiding things, David said. That's not your fault. Over the following weeks, Rebecca settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She woke before dawn to help with the morning feeding, spent her days learning new skills, and fell into bed each night exhausted but satisfied. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done, but it was also healing in ways she hadn't expected. David was a patient teacher, showing her how to repair fence posts, how to recognize when an animal was sick, and how to handle the horses safely. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing something, and he seemed genuinely impressed by how quickly she was learning. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into her stay. David's prize Murray Luna went into labor during a thunderstorm. The foal was breech, and David needed help to turn it. Rebecca had never assisted with a birth before, but she followed his instructions without hesitation. For 6 hours, they worked together in the barn while the storm raged outside. Rebecca held the flashlight steady while David worked, and when he needed an extra pair of hands, she didn't flinch. When the foal finally emerged, alive and healthy, they both collapsed against the stall wall, exhausted but triumphant. You've got steady hands, David said, watching the newborn colt struggle to stand for the first time. And a steady heart. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had said something genuinely nice about her? When had she last felt useful, competent, needed? Thank you, she whispered Dot as they watched Luna clean her baby. Rebecca realized something had shifted inside her. The desperate, broken woman who had arrived during the storm was still there, but she was getting stronger. The ranch work was rebuilding more than just her physical strength. It was rebuilding her confidence, her sense of purpose, her belief that she could handle whatever life threw at her. David seemed to sense the change too. Over dinner that night, their conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. They talked about the ranch, about the horses, about their plans for the next day. It felt almost normal, like they were partners rather than strangers thrown together by circumstances. For the first time since Michael had left, Rebecca fell asleep without crying. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was starting to believe she could handle them. She was finding her footing in this new life. And maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring arrived at Copper Creek Ranch with a burst of wildflowers and new life. Rebecca had been living and working on the ranch for 3 months now, and the transformation was remarkable. Her hands, once soft from office work, were now calloused and strong. Her arms had developed muscle from lifting feed bags and hay bales. Most importantly, the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by something that resembled hope. David had watched this change with growing admiration. Every morning, Rebecca was up before dawn, ready to tackle whatever the day brought. She'd learned to read the weather signs, to spot when an animal was feeling unwell, and to handle the horses with confidence. What impressed him most wasn't just her willingness to work, but her genuine care for the animals and the land. The ranch house had changed too. Rebecca had asked permission to plant a small vegetable garden behind the kitchen, and now fresh herbs and tomatoes were growing in neat rows. She'd painted the faded window shutters a cheerful blue, and wildflowers from the pasture brightened the kitchen table. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't since David's grandmother had passed away 10 years earlier. The people in Cedar Falls, the nearest town, had begun to notice the changes too. When David brought Rebecca to the feed store for the first time, the owner, Mrs. Henderson, had been polite but cautious. Strangers were unusual in their small community, and a woman living alone with a bachelor rancher was sure to raise eyebrows. "This is Rebecca," David had said simply. "She's been helping me with the ranch work." Mrs. Henderson had looked Rebecca up and down, taking in her work clothes and confident posture. "Well, that's nice," she'd said, but her tone suggested she was reserving judgment. Rebecca understood the scrutiny. Small towns were protective of their own, and she was clearly an outsider. But she was determined to prove herself worthy of their acceptance, not just for her own sake, but for David's. She could see how much this community meant to him, and she didn't want to cause him any trouble. Her opportunity came during the annual church fundraiser. The congregation was raising money for a new roof, and they needed volunteers to help organize the event. Rebecca quietly approached the pastor's wife and offered to help however she could. "I used to organize events at my old job," she explained. "I know it's not much, but I'd like to contribute something." The pastor's wife, Helen, was a kind woman who believed in giving people second chances. She put Rebecca in charge of coordinating the food donations, a task that required diplomacy and organizational skills. Rebecca threw herself into the work with the same determination she'd shown on the ranch. She visited every family in the area, introducing herself properly and listening to their stories. She learned about the Johnson family's struggles with medical bills, the Martinez family's new baby, and old Mr. Thompson's arthritis that made it hard for him to get around. By the time the fundraiser arrived, Rebecca had not only organized an impressive spread of food, but she'd also quietly arranged for some of the stronger volunteers to help. Mr. Thompson with his yard work, and she'd connected the Johnson family with a program that could help with their medical costs. The event was a huge success, raising more money than anyone had expected. But more importantly, Rebecca had proven herself to be someone who cared about the community, not just someone passing through. "You did good," David told her as they drove home that evening. "Grandmother would have liked you." It was the highest compliment he could have given her, and Rebecca felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring weather. As the weeks passed, their relationship began to shift in subtle ways. David found himself looking forward to their conversations over morning coffee, and Rebecca started staying up later just to spend more time talking with him on the porch. They shared stories about their pasts, their dreams, and their fears. The walls they'd both built around their hearts were slowly coming down. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late April. Rebecca had been at the ranch for almost 4 months when David received a phone call that changed everything. A real estate developer from California was interested in buying the ranch. Not just interested, was offering 3 times what the property was worth. David hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. 3 times the appraised value would set him up for life. He could pay off all his debts, buy a small house somewhere, and never have to worry about money again. But it would also mean the end of Copper Creek Ranch, the end of everything his family had built over 4 decades. What was that about? Rebecca asked, noticing his expression. David told her about the offer, watching her face carefully. He could see her processing what this would mean for both of them. If he sold the ranch, she'd have to leave. She'd have to start over again, just when she was beginning to feel like she'd found her place in the world. That's a lot of money, she said finally. Yeah, it is. What are you going to do? David looked out the window at the pasture where Luna and her foal were grazing peacefully. I don't know, he said honestly. The smart thing would be to sell the ranches. Barely profitable, and with my leg the way it is, I can't keep up with all the work forever. Rebecca felt her heart sink, but she tried to keep her voice steady. You have to do what's best for you. What about you? David asked. Where will you go? It was a question Rebecca had been dreading. Over the past few months, she'd begun to think of the ranch as home. She'd found purpose here, found peace, found herself again. The thought of leaving was almost unbearable. I'll figure something out, she said, the same words she'd used when her car broke down. But this time, they both knew she had more options than she'd had before. She'd grown stronger, more confident, more capable of handling whatever came next. That night, they sat on the porch in unusual silence. The easy conversation that had become their routine felt forced and awkward. Both of them were thinking about the future, about what would happen if David sold the ranch. I need to tell you something, Rebecca said finally. I got a letter from my lawyer today. My divorce is final. David looked at her. How do you feel about that? Relieved, she said honestly. Like I can finally close that chapter of my life. And move on. Where do you want to move on to? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said. A few months ago, I thought I'd lost everything. But being here, working with you, being part of this community, I've realized I didn't lose everything. I found something better. David felt something shift in his chest. What do you mean? I mean I don't want to leave, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I don't have any right to ask you to keep the ranch just because I want to stay, but what? But I love it here. I love the work, I love the animals, I love the community, I love... She stopped, not quite ready to finish that sentence. David turned to face her fully. You love what? Rebecca took a deep breath. I love the life we've built together. I know it started as just a business arrangement, but it's become something more than that. At least for me, David reached over and took her hand. For me too, he said quietly. They sat there holding hands, watching. The stars come out over the mountains. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt like everything might actually be okay. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. I can't ask you to give up a life-changing amount of money for me, she said finally. You're not asking, David replied. I'm choosing. This ranch, this life, it's worth more than money. Rebecca felt tears pricking her eyes. Are you sure? David squeezed her hand. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. As they sat together under the vast Montana sky, Rebecca realized she'd found something she'd never even known she was looking for. Not just a home, but a partner. Not just security, but love. The storm that had brought her to this place had been devastating, but it had also been the beginning of the most important chapter of her life. The morning after David made his decision to keep the ranch, Rebecca woke up feeling lighter than she had in months. For the first time since arriving at Copper Creek, she didn't have to wonder what would happen next. But as she made coffee and watched David limping more than usual as he headed to the barn, reality set in. Turning down the developer's offer meant they still had to find a way to make the ranch profitable. Over breakfast, they spread out the ranch's financial records on the kitchen table. The numbers weren't pretty. The ranch was barely breaking even, and with David's medical expenses from his military injuries, they were living month to month. Rebecca had learned enough about ranch operations to understand the challenges they faced. We need to diversify, she said, studying the figures. We can't rely just on cattle prices. David nodded. I've been thinking about that. We could offer horseback riding lessons, maybe board horses for people in town. What about training? Rebecca asked. You're amazing with horses. People would pay good money to have their horses trained properly. David looked surprised. You really think so? I know so. I've watched you work with Luna's colt. You have a gift. They spent the next few weeks developing a business plan. Rebecca's organizational skills, combined with David's knowledge of horses and ranching, made them a formidable team. They researched pricing, developed marketing materials, and started spreading the word through the community. The first client came through Mrs. Henderson at the feed store. Her teenage daughter wanted to learn to ride, and she'd heard that David was thinking about giving lessons. Within 2 weeks, they had 6 students signed up for riding lessons. Rebecca threw herself into the new venture with enthusiasm. She organized schedules, handled payments, and even learned to teach basic riding skills herself. David was amazed at how naturally she took to it. The same determination that had helped her learn ranch work now helped her master the business side of their operation, but success brought new challenges. 3 months into their expanded business, Rebecca received an unexpected phone call. Her sister Jennifer was calling from Illinois, and she sounded upset. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you," Jennifer said. "I've been thinking about what happened with Michael, and I feel terrible about how I reacted. I should have been there for you." Rebecca felt a mix of emotions. Part of her was still hurt by her sister's lack of support during the divorce, but another part of her missed having family in her life. "It's okay," Rebecca said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "No, it's not," Jennifer continued. "I was so caught up in my own problems that I forgot what being a sister means. I want to make it right." The conversation lasted for over an hour, with both sisters sharing things they'd been holding back for years. Jennifer admitted she'd always been jealous of Rebecca's marriage, even though it had turned out to be a disaster. Rebecca confessed how abandoned she'd felt when Jennifer hadn't even called after the divorce. "I want to visit," Jennifer said finally. "I want to see this ranch you've been telling me about, and I want to meet David." Rebecca felt nervous about the visit, but also excited. She'd been so focused on building her new life that she'd forgotten how much she missed having family connections. When she told David about the planned visit, he was supportive but clearly apprehensive. "What if she doesn't like me?" he asked. "She'd love you," Rebecca assured him. "How could she not?" Jennifer's visit turned out better than anyone expected. She arrived expecting to find Rebecca living in some kind of primitive conditions, but instead found a thriving ranch operation and a sister who was happier than she'd been in years. David won her over immediately by teaching her to ride and showing her the new foal. "You're glowing," Jennifer told Rebecca as they sat on the porch one evening, watching David work with the horses. "I haven't seen you this happy since we were kids." "I feel like I'm finally living the life I was meant to live," Rebecca admitted. "And David?" Rebecca smiled. "David is everything Michael wasn't. He's honest, kind, hardworking. He makes me feel like I can accomplish anything." "He looks at you like you hung the moon," Jennifer observed. That night, after Jennifer had gone to bed, David and Rebecca sat on the porch talking about the future. The conversation naturally turned to their relationship and what they meant to each other. "I love you," David said suddenly, the words coming out rushed and nervous. Rebecca felt her heart skip. "I love you too," she replied, realizing she'd been waiting to say those words for weeks. "I know this might seem fast," David continued, "but I can't imagine my life without you anymore. You've changed everything for me." "You saved my life?" Rebecca said. "Not just that night in the storm, but every day since. You helped me find myself again." David took her hands in his. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer." Rebecca's heart was racing. "What is it? Will you marry me?" A question hung in the air between them. Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes, but these were tears of joy, not sadness. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." David pulled her into his arms, and they kissed under the star-filled Montana sky. It was a kiss full of promise and hope, nothing like the desperate passion of her first marriage. This was steady, deep, real. They decided to have a small wedding in the fall after the busy summer season was over. The ceremony would be held right there on the ranch, in the pasture where they'd first worked together to save Luna's colt. The entire town of Cedar Falls would be invited, along with Rebecca's sister and David's military friends. As summer progressed, the ranch continued to thrive. Word of mouth brought more clients for horse training and riding lessons. They added a small gift shop selling local crafts and horse-related items. Rebecca's vegetable garden expanded into a small farm stand that attracted visitors from town, but the real success was measured in smaller moments. David's nightmares became less frequent, and his chronic pain seemed more manageable. Rebecca's confidence grew with each challenge she successfully met. They made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. Their wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Rebecca wore a simple white dress that she'd bought in town, and David wore his best suit. The ceremony was officiated by the local pastor, with the entire community gathered to witness their vows. "I promise to weather every storm with you," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I promise to be your sanctuary always," David replied as they kissed to seal their marriage. Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The storm that had driven her to Copper Creek Ranch had seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it had been the beginning of the most beautiful chapter of her life. 5 years later, as Rebecca watched David teach their 3-year-old son to ride his first pony while she held their infant daughter, she marveled at how completely her life had changed. The ranch was thriving, their marriage was strong, and she'd found her place in the world. The little boy who had been so afraid of storms now loved them, running outside to watch the lightning dance across the sky. Rebecca would join him on the porch, no longer afraid of the thunder and wind. She'd learned that storms could be destructive, but they could also clear the air and make room for new growth. "Remember when you first came here?" David asked one evening as they watched another thunderstorm roll across the mountains. "I was so scared," Rebecca admitted. "I thought I'd lost everything." "You had lost everything," David said gently. "But that made room for something better." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I'm glad I got lost in that storm," she said. "It led me home." As lightning illuminated the ranch that had become their sanctuary, Rebecca knew that whatever storms the future might bring, they would face them together. She was exactly where she belonged, with the man who had promised to never let her go again, on the land they'd built their life upon, surrounded by the love they'd created from the ashes of their former lives.